today I decided to take us out to a small village on the coast of Brittany called Penlan. Penlan, P-E-N-L-A-N. Penlan. And a little bit later on we'll be walking over there to the point, but for now I'm just going to take a little walk up to this point. In these times of lockdown, it's nice to get out and about. I don't have my face mask on right now because there's nobody here. I literally am in the middle of nowhere on a beach, following a cove. And I'm walking up to a particular rock, and we'll start the chat this morning. I don't like giving lectures, but we'll start the chat this morning here in Penlan. A rock called Crapo. Crapo. Lovely word, isn't it? Let your own imagination wander with that one. So we're getting to my first destination. I'm following the coast here of southern Brittany, as I've already said. Brittany is that big triangular peninsula that sticks out into the Atlantic on the west coast of France. And I, as a Briton or British guide, I live here. My wife is a French guide for Rick Steves. I'm a British guide for Rick Steves, and for my own company, Seymour Travels. We live here. I live here because my wife lives here. She works all of the France tours for Rick, and I do the British tours for Rick. So I do a lot of commuting in my spare time. Anyway, in these times of pandemic, we're all having to resort to something else, and one of the things that I'm turning to is obviously I've been spending a bit of time building my own small company up during this last year and a half, but also doing little videos of the neighbourhood, of the area. So here's one. Brittany, what's it synonymous with? Well, oysters, shellfish, ancient history, medieval castles, lesser known chateaux, or manoirs as we call them here. Also the name Brittany, Little England. Why is it called that? Well, Brittany. In the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, when Britain, the land of the Brittoni, as the Romans called it, was being ransacked by the Saxons because the Romans themselves had pulled out of what we now call England. The Saxons were invading, essentially, and taking land and wealth. And the people who lived there, those post-Roman Britons, were fleeing. So minor nobility, farmers fled, and they came here to this, what was a wilderness area at that point in time, what we now call Brittany. They didn't just come here, they gave it a name, they gave it their name, and that's why we still call it Brittany today. They settled, they farmed, they became the missionaries, they became the hermits, they became the minor lords, the earls, and then time took over. We went into the Middle Ages in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. Went through turbulent times throughout intervening centuries, but there was a lasting legacy here, and many of you who know me know that I like my stones. Well, I'm just going to turn the camera around because I want to show you something. And this is what I want to show you. This is a stone, or an assembly of stones called Le Crapaud, and it's on this headland, just a small headland, very beautiful. There are actually mussel farms here in the waters just in front of us. You can see the seaweed lying on the rocks, and you can see this collection of stones barely hanging to the headland. Now this is the remains of a tomb. Now imagine a trench dug in the soil here on what was once quite a headland that went out 100 or 200 meters further into the sea. And on top of that hill, that headland, a great man was buried. They cut a trench in the ground, they lined the trench with large stones, and then they put capstones over the top of it. Of course, during the intervening centuries, Mother Nature has eroded that land mass, that headland. The sea has encroached, and these stones are starting to fall into the ocean. Now, if you look around me, I'm going to pan the camera slightly. You can see there are headlands everywhere. On that side of me, across the water, off to my left. And I can promise you that on every one of those headlands there was a tomb just like this. What period are we talking about? When was this individual, or when were these 2 or 3 people buried? We don't know, by the way, who was interred in here. Time tells on these things. We have no written records, of course, but we do know that at least one individual was buried in this tomb, and it dates back to about 5,500 to 6,000 years ago. Let that sink in for a moment. 5,500 to 6,000 years ago, people were living here, hugging the coasts of Brittany. Now I'm going to come back to that in a little while. I want you to take in the beauty that is this area. As I walk up the hill, because I want to show you something else as well. Isn't it lovely to be beside the seaside on a day like today? You can see headlands everywhere, little coves. It really is a pretty part of the world. Bonjour. You can get the occasional runner. And just a little bit further until I get to my destination. It's up on this headland. Of course, occasionally you bump into some very strange people who are walking in the opposite direction. Hello. Bonjour. Oh, I should say bonjour.
Fancy meeting you here.
This is my babe Tony. She's just walking in the opposite direction, doing a bit of research and development herself, but enjoying the sunshine. Nice to be outside, isn't it, babe?
Beautiful day. Beautiful.
You know where I'm going, don't you?
I do. I've just been there. Bon continuation.
I'll catch up with you in a bit. So I'm going up on top of that hill. Now Tony's just been walking in the opposite direction. She's going to carry on walking around the peninsula, and I'm going to go back in a little while and film 1 or 2 pieces of that as well. But first of all, as I said a couple of times now, I want to show you this. Now, the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, began in this part of the world about 7,500 to 8,000 years ago, and then ran continually up until about 1500, 1800 BC. So quite a big chunk of time. But the Neolithic, the Neolithic Stone Age, was important to this part of the world. For some reason, large populations of people gathered on the coast of Brittany, farming, communing, socialising, trading, and building in large stones. Now, you've heard me talk about this before in previous talks. Cairn is just up the road from here. It's the greatest conglomeration of large stone edifices anywhere in the world. In fact, Brittany has 80% of the world's standing stones associated with the New Stone Age, which is quite an amazing achievement. But what am I talking about when I talk about New Stone Age, new stone structures? Well, we're going to have a look at one such edifice, because really that's what it is. It's a structure. It's not always tombs, although of course very often it is. And here we are, I'm walking up to it. I should slow down. I'm out of breath a little bit. It's been a bit of a hike. And this, as many of you know, this is what I like to do in my spare time. I like to walk the trails and discover sites like this. It really gives me a sense of being, a sense of belonging to something much bigger than just myself. It helps me understand politics, religion, Helps me put all of those things in perspective, and very often take them out of perspective. Religion being one of them. Organised religion today, what was it? Well, it's just a derivative of what came before. And here we are. I'm in amongst a great stone site. You can see these large granite boulders. On almost every headland here in Brittany, that's where I was a few minutes ago. This is where I am now. And I promise you, on each of these peninsulas, there are other massive monuments. This particular one, this was a number of tombs. One of them was a very large burial chamber, very similar to what we saw a few minutes ago, only much bigger. And here's the interior of a burial chamber or passage grave, the sort of thing that I'm actually sitting on now, only more complete. This is the great tomb of Barna up on the northwest coast of Brittany. It's massive, it's huge. And coming up here is an image of one just across the bay from where I'm sitting here doing this presentation. It's called Le Petit Mont. And this is an aerial view of Cairn, the great stone alignments at Cairn. And being bigger, I guess I should try and describe to you what it was. So large trenches, in this case, not just one, but several. Large trenches cut into the ground, again lined, and again with capstones put over the trench and the stones that were lining the trenches. Then over that again, there would be a pile of rubble placed, after, of course, interring the individual or individuals inside. A big pile of rubble, a cairn, so cairn burial. Now, some of these cairn burials in this part of the world are huge. There's one up the coast. A colleague of mine, Virginie Moret, was born within spitting distance of it in the very western corner of Brittany. It's called Barna, almost like Big Nose. But it's right on the headland, on the western point of Finisterre. Finisterre itself, a word that means the end of the earth. But then you have this massive headland jutting out into the Atlantic Ocean with this huge burial site on top of it. 8 or 9 individuals buried inside this massive cairn that stretches 800 feet long in one direction. It is a massive structure, 80 feet high. Just a massive structure, and there are several like that here in Brittany, several tomb locations like the one I've just arrived at here in Penlan. So they're everywhere. So it is a part of whom we are here in Brittany. It's devolved slowly as time went by, from the Neolithic period through the Bronze Age through into the Iron Age. It lost its importance. So by the time the Romans came here, there were 1 or 2 largish settlements here, but there are no real record of any trouble amongst the Gauls in this part of what we now call France. Except for one up the coast. There's a small town called Vannes, Vannes, and it gained its name from a tribe of people that occupied this area called the Veneti. And it is the only recorded naval battle between the Romans against the Gauls or the Celts. The only recorded naval battle took place right here in the Gulf of Morbihan in western Brittany. And that's pretty much all we know about the people who lived in this area, so we know scant about them. They were not particularly important people, at least in the Roman world. But of course, I've already mentioned it was after the Roman collapse that the world changed essentially for people such as this. They had lived under the Roman yoke for 3 or 4 centuries at that point in time, and as the Romans retreated from the British Isles, people thought they would gain from their newfound freedom. Not the case at all. Administration went, safety protection went in the form of armed forces, and as a result of that, it opened up that new world to other groups of people like the Saxons, like the Danes, the Jutes. They came in from Scandinavia, northern Germany, taking land from the British Isles by force. And that meant that these peaceable people with no protection had to flee. And many of them did, and they fled here. And they set up small villages, small towns. They brought with them Christianity. Many of the towns here in Brittany now are named after saints from southern England, from southwestern England, Devon, Cornwall, from southern Wales, even from Ireland. But those are generally monks or missionaries who had moved from Wales to Ireland and then arrived here. So quite an interesting area from that perspective. Many of the place names are named after local saints who arrived, not as saints, but they arrived with stories to tell in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries. So all of a sudden around the coast of Brittany again there is sign of life, something's happening again. And small fishing communities developed and grew. Time goes by, we go on into the what we now call the feudal system, the medieval period, where there are great lords now controlling the land and taxing everybody and everything on it. This happened throughout Europe, so it's not a story unknown to most of you, I'm sure. Here in Brittany, the Duke of Brittany, a powerful man in his own right, allied himself with the Duke of Normandy and invaded England in reverse in 1066. So we've gone from waves of immigrants from the British Isles. Now all of a sudden some of these people are invading Britain to gain those lands back. So it's quite an interesting story, but I'm going to jump forward a long way. This location was strategically important to a group of people, the Germans. Going into World War I, the independence movement here in Brittany, there was a very strong one. They wanted to, I'm going to keep moving, they wanted to ally themselves with Germany, these powerful German forces that were attacking Europe, because they saw an opportunity for independence themselves. They've, as I've said, have always associated themselves with Britain, hence the name still standing. But they wanted to be an independent state. And by aligning themselves with Germany, they thought that this is something that could happen, particularly if Germany were the victors, as was not the case. But they'd also seen a model across the English Channel and the Irish Sea in Ireland. In 1916, there was a rebellion in Ireland against the monarchy of England. These people in Ireland, they allied themselves with Germany as well, for the same reasons. But also an affiliation with the style of politicking that was going on in Germany. But they saw an opportunity to gain their independence. They were anti-monarchists as well, and eventually they gained their independence in Ireland. Here in Brittany, they felt they could gain the same thing by doing the same thing. So they were in small way supported and supportive of France, of Germany. Well, nothing came of that, except that there was the beginning now of an independence movement in Brittany. Between the wars, this independence movement grew, became more powerful, to the point where in 1932-33, I believe it was, there was a general election in France, and 200,000 of the 600,000 Bristol voters voted for the independence movement. So that's a third of the population, if you want to make it simple. Why was this the case? Well, during World War I, the occupants of Brittany were treated as third-class citizens, as a wayward people. And out of the population of about 2.25 million people who lived in Brittany, 250,000 of those people, those men, lost their lives. So do the maths, 2.25 million people living in the whole of Brittany. 250,000, 1 in 10 of them lost their lives. Now I like to do this, split the 2.25 million in half, men and women, and then divide that male half into 3 parts. Essentially you have 1/3 of them are fighting age. So you can see right away that the statistics were abnormally high. In fact, they were twice the attrition rate that you saw in the rest of France, which is an extremely high attrition rate. And as a result of that, and having gained nothing from it themselves, having been treated essentially as unshod servants of the French military, and they were treated as cannon fodder. They were thrown into the front lines, very often without rifles and very often with footwear. So quite an atrocious thing that happened. And of course then they had these heartfelt grievances after the war, which turned into votes between the wars. And I shall pick up on that story in a moment. We have a friendly dog who's associated itself with me. I'll pick up on that story in a moment. And just as an aside, here's the flag of Brittany, the black and white flag with the representations of ermine up in the left-hand corner. And this is the flag of the Breton Independence Party, their Nazi flag, courtesy of records from the Second World War. There's the lady with her dog. And the dog, I think, was about to use me as a tree. so I had to just shoo it off. But here we are, this is what we're walking past as I head back in towards Penlan. So between the wars we had the rise of independence in Brittany, and an independence movement that was getting more vociferous and more dangerous to the French authorities in Paris. Of course, along comes the period of fascism in Europe. I'm not sure when that began. I tend to think it began with the fall of the Bourbon monarchy in France. I think the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte was the beginning of fascism. That's my belief, that's my feeling. The politicking is correct, so why shouldn't that be called? Why shouldn't he be called a fascist dictator in the likes of Mussolini and the likes of Adolf Hitler? He was just first. Anyway, we have the rise of fascism in Europe between the wars, and not least of which here in Brittany. And of course, with another war looming in the early 1930s, the independence authorities here in Brittany decided to make approaches to the German authorities, the rising Nazi authorities, and make an alliance. And there was agreement reached. It was a little bit limp or lame. The Germans didn't really want to associate themselves with Brittany. But they did see an advantage could be gained, perhaps, in the long run. Anyway, war came and Germany invaded France. And at that point in time, things really started to heat up. The Breton authorities made real approaches at this point to the German authorities and said, listen, you can march your troops in. We're not going to fight against you. We're not going to upset you. In fact, more than that, we'll fight on your side. Just guarantee us independence. German authorities didn't want to do that. They didn't see an advantage in that for themselves. They were sweeping across France already. But what they did do was say, well, listen, you can be a mini state, if you like, within the greater German Empire. Semi-autonomous. Just provide us some troops and police forces and have at it. And that's exactly what happened. Unfortunately, only about 150 men who were already interred in prisoner of war camps decided to become part of this new force, this Breton force associated with the new Germany, and therefore fairly inconsequential. But there were repercussions, and I will come back to that in a moment. But here's a chance for you to look at this beautiful view. We're going to head on down into Penlan. That's the village right ahead of me. And check out one or two other lovely items. Just a peaceful scene. As we move along, I just want you to look at these cypress trees. I mentioned these in a previous video. They're dying all over France. They're dying. There is a problem. It arrived with some trees that were imported at the turn of the 1900s from Southern California, and it's now affecting cypress trees right across the face of Europe, and they're all dying. You can see them splitting right there, in fact, on its way out, I'm afraid. And there won't be many of those left on our landscape, and here in Brittany there are many of them. You see there's some more up there on the hill, that little group of three there. But being in pandemic, everything's closed. There's a little bar bistro, one of my favourite little coffee shops. It's closed. There's nobody here in the car park or the tennis courts, and yet it should be busy right now. But we're all suffering, aren't we? Now, as a tour guide, I have to show this to you. We're in France, and many of you who have travelled here know that finding public toilets is very difficult. Well, I told you we're in Brittany, and you'll have no problem finding public conveniences in Brittany. I'm not sure really why. I think there is obviously this close association with the British Isles across the water, but I also think there's that sense of independence. Another thing that stands out quite starkly here in Brittany is there are no toll roads. Everywhere else in France there are very expensive toll roads, but here in Brittany there are none. And this actually goes back centuries, where there was a law made to prevent that from happening, to make the highways freely available to everybody, and they still are today. And here's another little article to look at. This beautiful house, see lots of these slate roofed homes all over Brittany, because slate is mined here in these hills. It's a naturally occurring material, and those of you who've been to Paris have seen this slate on the roofs of Paris. Not only that, but you've seen creperies all over Paris. Well, creperies aren't Parisian, they come from Brittany. Creperies and glaiteries, and it's because the men who mined this material, this slate, out of the hills around here, went with the slate into Paris to put the roofs, roofs on the houses of the new Paris as it was being rebuilt after Revolution. So of course these workers arrived by train, steam engine, in the great Parises, the Gare du Nord, for instance, in Paris. And as they disembarked, they wanted to eat. Well, they're going to eat what they know, aren't they? And that's why creperies and glaiteries sprang up everywhere in those areas of Paris, and are still there today. I have to say, there are literally hundreds of them around those great stations in Paris today. But slate has been mined out of these hills, these valleys, for centuries. So we've come down by the river here now. You see these little boats, clam boats. This one here is an old oyster boat, all high and dry. The tide is out at the moment. But I mentioned already oysters and mussels, and those are two foods, two products which are associated with this area. In fact, the most famous oyster in the world, and probably the most highly prized oyster in the world, the Bellon oyster. It gets its name from originating in a small port just to the north of us along the coast here, about 30 miles to the north. These people still flock there to this day from all over France to get their Bellon oysters in the season. It's a lovely section of waterway. We're looking at marshes here as well, salt marshes of course. Now they're growing over and being swallowed up by the sea again, but in times gone by they were extremely valuable. One of the reasons why the Romans did occupy this area is because they wanted the salt. Salt has been panned and created in this area for thousands of years, and the Romans wanted it. It was extremely valuable to them. You've heard me say it before. We get the word salary from sel, salt. So it was a highly prized commodity indeed. And going into the medieval period, one of the reasons why some large towns, there's one just down the road from us called Gironde, became very powerful financially, was because it was sat in the middle of some wonderfully productive salt marshes. And of course, creating salt, you're essentially creating money. You are literally creating money, baking it out of the brine. So Brittany became at that point in time famous and synonymous with salt, at a time when oysters were poor man's food, which they certainly aren't today. This is quite nice to see. This is a little ship here. Was a fishing boat at one point, a little sloop. It was actually built in this harbour, and eventually lost its life over there in the mud. And when I first arrived here in Brittany about 10 years ago, they had just salvaged this from the mud, and it's been restored. And it doesn't have the flag mast up today. There's more work and attention being paid to that. But it's a lovely little craft, and the sort of thing you would have found with 2 or 3 sails, slooping around these waters, these navigable rivers of Brittany. I'm just going to carry on walking as I talk here. This is a lovely view across the beach. That's where Tony and I very often go for a walk. Nobody on it today, which is rather nice to see. But I'm walking down towards this jetty. So again, another headland. There are more standing stones up on the headland beyond those trees. But first of all, we're going to walk out onto the jetty. So I was talking about Breton independence and going into World War II. Some people collaborated and actually put themselves into uniform on the German side, acted as policemen, as prison guards, that sort of thing here in Brittany. It was counterproductive in a way for the independence movement, because these men were here at a time when Germany decided not to give Brittany independence. Now they're already in uniform, and now they're going to be treated suspiciously by their own people. And as the war went on, you had three factions arise here in Brittany. You had the independence movement, still quite powerful, quite strong, well equipped and well armed, because of course the French army had collapsed, so many of those men returned home with arms. You had the pro-German movement, who were fascists essentially. I make no bones about that. They were fascists. They had every ideological idea in common with the Germans. And then you had the French mainstream population. So you had three factions essentially, all who took up arms, and throughout the war were fighting each other here in Brittany, the Marquis. And at one point in time it was guesstimated there were about 3,500 men in uniform. When they were fighting, they would don their French military uniforms, because then they couldn't be shot as a spy. But then they go back to the peasant garb at the end of the day. So this civil war essentially was going on in Brittany throughout the war. Now towards the end of the war, special forces from Britain were airlifted and airdropped in. And they helped unify some of those elements, those disparate elements, and arm them and equip them, because they let them know that there was a great invasion coming. Eventually occurred in Normandy, but it was felt at the time that it might actually happen on the west coast of Brittany here. So they're great sea defences. The Germans knew this was going to happen. They didn't know where it was going to happen. We all know that. So to protect from great invasion, the Germans built sea defences everywhere. The Atlantic Wall, as it was called, amongst other things. But the Civil War was still roaring until the Special Forces arrived and started to amalgamate some of those disparate elements. Some of them were still not amalgamated. Those who were pro-German were not. So the fascists were still not amalgamated into that contingent of forces that were fighting against the Germans. Of course, they had alliances with and they were collaborating with Germany. And after the war, many of them were literally taken out by local peasantry and shot. There was not a genocide, but there was a bit of a slaughter that took place here in Brittany. Those who fought for France, those who fought for the independence movement and were anti-Germany, and those who fought for the independence movement and were pro-Germany were all up against each other still. Those who were for Germany were summarily executed in large numbers. And when I first arrived here in Brittany, I thought that these people were victims of Germany. I see these little plaques and markers on farm walls and small villages everywhere. But I've since realised that wasn't the case. Many of those people were collaborators with Germany who were executed. So sometimes history tells a different story than what we actually perceive. Now, this is something I normally do in my videos, and that is to interject a little bit of additional information. I come back to the office and I sit and I mull over what I've been musing and try and inject something else to make it more sensible to myself and of course to the listener nowadays. So I was talking about what was going on here in Brittany, and the interesting thing to think about is that much of what I've been talking about could be put into a much grander scale within France itself. So I've been talking about fascism, I've been talking about the rise of the Pro-Bresson Independence Party, but these things were happening across France. War does strange things to nations and the fabric of nations. And you've probably heard of Vichy France, a third of France essentially, which during the Great Invasion of Germany was ceded to Germany by the French. It's a piece of real estate within France, basically the southwest, that became autonomous in the same way that Brittany wanted to become. So essentially a minion of Germany. And Vichy France was, as I say, a large tract of France. What's interesting to me is, and I didn't realise this until I came here 10 years ago, is that these tendencies, Vichy France was influenced in large part by fascism, as was Brittany. As I suspect was much of Europe. We know Italy was. We know that the Soviet Union was scared to death of fascism. During the war it became apparent there's a reason why. But I think one of the interesting things to think about is the fact that today probably the second largest faction within French politics is the Front National, the National Front. Fascism is alive and well, and 1/3 of the people in France votes for the National Front every single election. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the upcoming election. Macron is essentially a new boy on the block politically. He has a new party. He formed that so that he become president, so that he become leader of the French Republic. But if he steps down, there's a void that could be filled, and this story will go on, and it will have legs for many generations to come. But it is interesting to think that the Front National, led by Marine Le Pen, whose family are Breton, could become the powerful woman in France. Think about that. There in the distance, I don't know if you can see it, there is a windmill. There are many of those, old and new. Windmills were used historically, obviously, to grind corn, to create the flour with which galettes and crepes are made, and of course to bake bread. But of course, more recently, windmills are used to create electricity, and it's a burgeoning opportunity for big business in France these days. There's a lot of government money available and European money available to help the new wind industry grow, and it's growing rapidly. I'll stand still, you might just be able to make them out in the distance. There's a couple of land-based windmills, just little babies, but they're here, and they're here to stay. After the war, what happened to the independence movement? Well, it carried on. It still was there. In fact, 60s, 70s, 80s, there were still bombings created by this independence movement, much as the IRA were bombing Britain. Brittany was bombing mainland France and bombing France's administrative headquarters in Brittany. So terrorism, we call it terrorism today, that's what it was. But these were people who felt that Brittany should be separate, and there are still some of those today. The Breton language is barely alive now in one or two far-flung reaches of Brittany. I'm just going to go up the steps. But the Breton language is Brettonic, or Brethonic, Brethonic. Go and read it, go and Google it. You'll see how complicated that subject is. I will touch upon that another day because I love it. So it's a fascinating subject, and it roots many of us who live in Western Europe together. Language is a powerful thing. Philology is a powerful thing. So go and look up Brethonic. That's your homework for the day. I will talk about it on another day. But Breton as a language does still exist. In fact, place names in Brittany have to be in both French and in Breton. Bonjour. Courting couple out enjoying the sun. So here is a sign of German fortifications. It's a Tobruk machine gun and mortar posts. They're dotted all the way around France's coastline. Deeply embedded concrete bunker. Looking out over the bay. Commanding field of view, of course. Now I'm going to finish that here. I'm going to add a little bit more information. I'll go back to my office and give you some more explanations and fill this out a little bit. But I hope you've enjoyed the walk around Penlan here in Brittany today. And I hope you join me on another one soon. If you want to find out more details about my own company, as you know, I'm already a Rick Steves tour guide, but I have my own company, seymourtravels.co.uk. Is the website address. Seymour, S-E-Y-M-O-U-R, travels, Seymour Travels, all one word, .co.uk. Don't be afraid to find me on Facebook. I have a number of travel groups on Facebook, and I'm very happy to say, have a very good following. A lot of like-minded travellers, all interested in getting out and about and seeing the world again, which will happen very soon. So there we are. I'll see you soon. The sun was out. We're very lucky. Stay safe. Travel will be happening very, very soon. Good luck.